I'm a 23-year-old woman, and I'm half Cherokee, from Georgia. At the time that this story took place, my fiancé and I were living on a large farm in Maryland. We didn't use the farm, but we were renting a small house on the property, and were free to come and go around the grounds. I was only 19 at the time of this took place, and the only other residents in our home were myself, my fiancé, and our cat and dog. Our cat was a lunatic barn cat that I'd rescued because I can't say no to animals that need help, and our dog was my loyal pit bull, who was a sweet, cuddly, scaredy cat. She weighed about 75 pounds and scared of her own shadow. Our farm was situated on about 20 acres of land, and our driveway was about a half a mile long. So usually, when I would get home from work, my loyal dog and I would go for a walk, and usually I brought my fiancé with me. Not that I was afraid to go out alone, just that he spends too much time playing games and all. I like him using his legs. After our driveway was a 12-mile-long road through the woods and farms until it finally reconnected with civilization, so it was safe to say we were far from other people, except for our landlord, of course. The rest of it were miles of wheat fields and solid forest for 2 more miles. Now that you have a bit of layout, on to the really creepy bit. So, it started off like any other weekday evening. My fiancé and I returned home from work to our happy cottage and happy pets. Harley, our dog, was frantic to go out for a walk, so I quieted her and changed her into her walking clothes, and I asked if my fiancé wanted to come with me. He had gotten home shortly after me, and said he had seen one of the coyotes that we have had around close to the field by our house. As you may know, coyotes are mostly scavengers, especially out here on the East Coast, so I wasn't too worried, and I am very capable of defending myself. I caught him a puss, and then told Harley that we could go, and that we would be fine without him. Laughing to myself, we left the cottage and started walking toward the driveway. The sun was going down, and the October air had started to get a chill to it, and it rustled through the cornfields next to our long driveway. The corn was about 6 feet tall at this point in the year, and impossible to see through, so I assumed that my fiancé was just trying to scare me because there was no way he could have seen a coyote in this field. Harley was enjoying her time in the field, tearing in and out of the corn stalks. On our way up to the driveway, I knew that was a big of a coward as she was, that she would alert me if there was any danger coming, and she would very quickly run away. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, the sun had set and the moon, which had already come out, was shining high about the fields. It wasn't quite full, but it provided enough light that I didn't need to use my flashlight or Harley's collar light. We turned left down the road and proceeded to cross the first section of the field. The first field was soybeans. If you don't know, they are relatively short plants that nothing but a rabbit could hide in. And off in the distance, I spotted a few deer, but nothing alarming, so we relaxed and enjoyed our walk through the night air. I threw a stick at Harley, and she brought it back. We do this over and over again, a typical dog and owner stuff. We reached the first small section of trees, and Harley stopped and bumped into my leg, letting me know there was something ahead. I wasn't a coyote or a deer, but there was a rabbit that had been hit by a passing car and was still struggling. As much as I hate to say this, there was no way it was going to live, and honestly, it's probably what drew the coyote pack in. I knelt down by it, using my knife quickly, and put it out of its misery, as my family had taught me, and let it pass into my next life. Feeling sad, but somewhat relieved that all we had encountered was a handful of deer and that poor rabbit, we continued our walk and passed into the next field. This was a wheat field, and the wheat was about ready for harvest, so it was quite tall and hard to see through. The field was quiet though, and Harley didn't do anything, so I figured that the coyotes had passed on if there had been any at all. Now this is the part that you have been waiting for. I don't know what it was, but here it is. We rounded the corner of the field and into an area with wheat on our left and the forest on our right, and the air seemed to go still. Harley got closer to me, and I heard rustling in the wheat field. I saw 3 tails circling back towards the forest. Coyotes. The eastern coyotes are small, but in a pack, they get pretty ballsy. Harley raised her heckles, and I yelled, Get out of here. Go on. Fuck off. As loud as I could at the coyotes. They started scattering off into the trees. I decided to turn around and get out of there before they decide to regroup, because I am brave. But I'm not going to walk into a darkened forest with a coyote pack and a cowardly pit bull. We turned to head back, and again I heard a rustling in the wheat. A confused coyote. Maybe. I thought that it must be. But no. Harley was standing stock still staring at the wheat, and I whistled for her to come to me. That high-pitched, ear-piercing, two-finger whistle. That snapped her out of it for a second, when my whistle was returned from the inside of the wheat. All of a sudden, all of the family legend I had heard came flooding back to me, and I expected to see a tall, thin creature emerge, but nothing did. I didn't smell rotting meat or feel a scent of dread. Instead, I was transfixed with fiery curiosity. I whistled again. The whistle was returned again. Very human sounding, but at the same time, not. Against my better judgment, I said, "Hello?" My own voice replied, "Hello?" My hand and my knife, I said, "Show yourself." Silence. No bugs, no coyotes, no Harley noises, just my own breath. Slowly, the rustling started again, and I turned on my flashlight. I shined it on the wheat field, and what I saw confuses me to this day. Animal eyes, that green-yellow reflection of light, was cast back at me, but what it was connected to didn't make sense. There was a girl, no more than 14 or 16, crouched in the wheat. She wore what I think must have been some kind of deerskin or fur, and she was naked otherwise. She was very thin and looked as though her skin had never seen sunlight. Her hair was long and tangled with wheaten leaves. Under any circumstances, I would have said she was beautiful, but at that moment, she was terrifying. We stared at each other for what must have been a solid minute or so, but felt like much longer, until I heard the unmistakable coyote howl from the forest. Both our heads snapped toward the noise, and I immediately heard her take off through the wheat toward the sound. At that same moment, Harley took off toward our house, and I went after her. We didn't stop running until we got to the driveway, and I stopped not wanting my fiancé to know I was running away from something. I could still hear the howling in the distance, and we started walking at a brisk pace. We made it back to the cottage with no further problems, and didn't tell my fiancé about it, as to not want him to think that I was crazy. She hadn't hurt me, so I didn't think it was right to hunt her. I was awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of coyotes outside our cottage. This wasn't unusual, but now I wondered if she was with them. When I was coming home from work about a month later, I had stopped obsessing about that night, and I almost thought I had imagined it when I slammed on my brakes for something in the road. It was dark, and my headlights hit its eyes and reflected green and yellow. It was a large coyote. It just stared at my car for a moment and then ran off into the woods. I know this sounds crazy, but I still wonder if that was her.
It was around 10 at night, off a little ways from Ocean City, Maryland. It was Mother, her friend, and my sister and I. We were driving home from our vacation, and I asked if we could take the back roads. I always loved seeing the woods at night, and it was the scenic route. We were driving down, and although I was one who asked for the trees, I was ironically on my phone texting and listening to music. We eventually came to a stretch of road that I didn't pay much attention to. It was boring, but I occasionally looked up every now and then, as I did the entire ride. It was a straight path forward, with nothing but streetlights, so we were driving and driving. As we crossed under the lights, it was almost relaxing. I went into a half-sleep trance. Then I suddenly woke up, and everything was fine. More lights as we drove by. No one was talking. My mom's boyfriend wasn't asleep, but there were no muffled conversations. Everything seemed calm. But I had this sudden awareness we were in the middle of the woods. It was dark and around 11:30 or 12. Without streetlights, you couldn't see anything but the stars. I immediately felt very paranoid. I turned my phone on and listened to the music. Then, we entered back to another stretch of lights and drove on, and I started to feel a bit better. This part is strange, because it was as if something told me to go to my phone, as if there was a notification. I checked and there was nothing there, and then I noticed something in my obscured vision. There were about 4 lights up ahead that were turned off, in an area where the road kind of turns. It was a fairly wooded area, and you couldn't see much without a light. So we slowed down. I didn't pay much attention to it, but this next part sticks with me. As we slowly approached the next light that was on, something crawled out from the woods and into the light. I looked up and thought it was a deer at first, but it kept moving out. It was limping, but when it fully emerged, what I saw was truly bone-chilling. A naked, ash-white skinny man crawled out on all 4s. It stopped, and as I saw it, it turned its head at us. Its eyes were deep charcoal black. We sped it fast and started driving. It wasn't human. As we drove past it, it jumped over our car weightlessly, defying physics. My mom's Mercedes had 2 sunroofs, and although it was a blur, I got a close look at it. As it passed over the car, it landed behind us and faded into the black. The scary part was, when it jumped over our car, our sunroof was open. I uploaded a story in January and sent it to you about a possible wendigo lurking around my house. I'm sending this to you again because it has reappeared, and I'm not sure if it's alone. This happened around April 10th. The sun was just beginning to rise, and I was walking around the property checking on all the pigs like usual. Most of them were lazing about in the hay, but I noticed as I slowly made my way out back, the pigs that were restless and making noises, letting you all know now that I had a machete that I shoved in my belt at the time. That was because of an increasing issue with coyotes, as well as the paranoia from my encounter a few months prior. Wondering what the problem was, I crept as quietly as I could out back, my hand hovering over the machete's handle as I did so. Peering over the crest of the hill, I'm greeted with nothing but agitated pigs pacing in their pens. "Phoom," I grunted, standing up straight and making my way up to the pens. "What's wrong, Latte?" I asked one of the pigs, scratching her head for comfort. She kept turning her head to look at the woods, making loud squeaks and whines in the process. Looking at some of the younger pigs, I noticed that they were doing the same thing. Despite feeling nervous, it was my job to see what was bothering them. So, swallowing hard, I make my way to the tree line, peering into the woods. As I'm looking around, I hear a branch break off to my right, my head whipping around to face the sound. Practically crawling up a steep, muddy ledge was what looked like the creature from before, except his pale skin was stained with what looked like blood, and it looked like it had been in a fight. One of its antlers were snapped in half, and patches of its fur and skin were hanging off of it. I must have made some sort of sound, because its head turned to face me, its gazes locked into mine. The only few seconds that I got to stare at this thing felt like an eternity, before it screamed at me and scuttled up the ledge as fast as it could, disappearing over the top. As soon as I couldn't see it, I hightailed it back to the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. If it was the same creature as before, I want to know what could have done that to it. At the same time, I don't. Frankly, it terrifies me to think that there might be something else out there. Something with enough strength and guts to attack something like that. Just hoping I'm overreacting and it was hit by a vehicle and not attacked by something else.
A few months back, I was on a routine 3rd shift. I work as a police officer in a very small town in Ohio. It is currently the middle of fall, I'm not going to say where. People can find it pretty easily. Anyway, I was on night patrol, driving in my patrol car. Most nights, we are required to get out of our cruisers to check areas our cruisers can't fit. There is a super long, almost 2-mile bike path we are supposed to walk down. Well, one night as usual, I got out and walked the path. Usually, we do this to make sure no one is hurt or overdosed. My flashlight was dimmed during the walk, since I forgot to put it on the charger earlier that day. About 1 mile into the walk, I started to feel very strange. Not a typical gut feeling. A feeling that you know something is wrong, or something is about to go wrong. I began to hear leaves crunching. Turning in every direction, the leaves would break. My light is so dim it is hard to see much of anything. I continue trying to get this walk over. I start to speed up. In doing so, I must have triggered something's instinct. Every time I sped up, the breaking of leaves would get louder and continue with my pace. I get to the point where I know something is there, so I just stop and listen. I waited for 5 minutes, hoping to catch some kids playing a prank or a fellow officer trying to get a laugh. But nothing. The sounds have stopped. I began shining my light all around me, slowly turning my light from the tree to tree. Then I noticed something odd. I passed by it the first time. I shine my light back in the direction I noticed from earlier. I can see something, but at the time, it was hard to make out. The only difference I noticed was the contrasting colors. Old gray and black with red and orange leaves and a brown tree. I shine my light up from it. Then, 2 huge glowing eyes. Nothing like I have ever seen before. I have seen deer, wolves, and other animal eyes that reflect light. Nothing like this. I hesitated, almost drawing my firearm. But I stopped myself, knowing that I could get myself in trouble if it was a prankster. This thing took 1 step out from behind the tree. I got a whole body view. It was covered in feathers, extremely tall, and didn't appear to be completely human. I noticed it had hands like a human, but it having feathers that looked almost forced into the skin. I start to back up. Thankfully, it never moved more than when it did earlier. I was frozen in fear, too scared to move. But I snapped out of it when dispatch radioed. "Police 1, check up." The sounds of the radio snapped me out of my trance. I started walking backwards, very quickly, not taking my eyes off this thing one time. It felt like forever. But I finally got back out of those woods. My cruiser was in the clearing. I bolted as fast as I could to it, not looking back until I got back in. I looked into the wood line from where I came in. Then I could see this thing's whole body, head shaped like a demonic owl. Head laying taut, just staring, with its huge eyes. Its body, covered in some parts by feather, other by skin that appeared to be falling off, like it was rotting. That terrible odor came through. So powerful, it is engraved into my memory. I unlocked my cruiser, crawled in and locked my doors. I attempted to shine my spotlight and brights at it, but it ran back into the woods, letting out a scream that was like no other. I could feel the creatures below rattle my insides, leaving me almost sick to my stomach. After it ran, I drove back up to my station, sitting inside to recap what had just happened. I asked my fellow officers about it sometime later, but got very odd responses. I was being told to never look where the noises came from. It would be better if I just ignored them altogether. I was confused at this point, wondering if they had seen it themselves, but I was never given a definitive answer, just told to keep my light charged and my eyes forward. I work as a paramedic in Louisiana. Needless to say, after being in this profession for a while, you'll see your fair share of creepy things. However, nothing I've experienced could top this. The unit that I work on is quite rural compared to most others in our fleet. It was a busy night, so we were posted at a halfway point between our station and another in town to cover both parts of the area. We linked to post off the road about a quarter of a mile into the woods so we would not be bothered while we were there. It was late, so my partner and I got into the back of our unit because there is much more room to stretch out and relax in the back. My partner was asleep, and I was messing around on my phone. I felt something bump into the side of our unit, shaking the whole truck. Now, our trucks are heavy, and it would take a substantial amount of force to shake it like I had felt. I woke my partner and told him, but he brushed it off, thinking I may have been dreaming or something. Then it happened again. He immediately shot up and looked out the window, and I did the same. We couldn't see a thing outside, and it was too dark. We made the decision to cut on the unit floodlights, which illuminate the entire area around the truck. I moved from the window to hit the button, and my partner stayed behind looking out the window. As soon as I turned them on, my partner gasped and jumped back from the window. I could see it as well. The light from the back of that unit illuminated an approximately 7-foot-tall creature. It looked like it was turned around, but I could not make out a face. Most of it was hairless, but I did see some matted patches of hair here and there on its body. It had extremely long, skinny arms that appeared to drag the ground behind it. Parts of the body that were hairless appeared to be gray and wrinkly. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its back towards us. We decided to radio dispatch and told them to get a police unit to our location, as there was a large animal outside of our unit. About 5 minutes later, we saw the lights from the police unit come from down the road. And the creature looked in the direction of the lights, turned its body, and very calmly walked into the woods. The officer walked up to our unit and opened the door. We explained to him what was going on. He said that he didn't see anything as he was pulling up, and whatever it was gone now. It's been a few months since seeing this creature, and I've never seen or heard anything like it, and I've not seen it since. Granted, we don't park in that area anymore. Needless to say, we have stayed in the front of the truck now when posting, ready to floor it and drive away if anything like this happens again.
My name is Carlos. I am now currently 14 years old. This sighting happens while I was backpacking in rural Arkansas, high in the mountains. Me and my friends, which for confidential reasons, I won't say their names, but let's call them Jerome, John, Caleb, and my crush who I will call Laura, went backpacking with my fellow church youth. On the very first day backpacking, I noticed how quiet it was. I mean that the forest was empty kinda. It was just silent. But I ignored it and put it off as maybe it was just very quiet here. But being a country boy, I should have known better. After long and tiring 5 hours of walking, we finally decided to stop and rest for the night. I will explain how the surrounding area looked like, because it is important. We were separated into two groups, guys and girls. Us guys, we slept in a clearing near a massive hill, while the girls slept under a ridge of a cliff, and on the right of both camps was a river, also in between the camps was a ravine. Us guys, being young and stupid, decided to explore before it was too dark. We ended up finding this cave around 30 feet away from our camp. After exploring the cave, which was empty, we decided to go eat dinner. For some reason, we didn't make a fire. After eating, our counselor told us that we needed to have a buddy system when we used the bathrooms because it was hunting season. After the meeting, we went to bed. That night, I woke up with a strong urge to pee. Being the good friend I am, I didn't wake up any of my sleeping friends as I climbed up that massive hill to pee behind a tree or near the top. Now, I know that was dumb, but hey, you'd rather go pee in a ravine. Now, what sounds better? As I was going up, I heard a branch break, but I brushed it off as some kind of nocturnal animal. During mid-pee, I heard a low growl. It was like a guttural growl. I was in mid-pee. I couldn't stop. As soon as I finished peeing, I raced down the hill and made the mistake of turning around. I saw a massive, easily 6-foot-tall, very pale humanoid-looking creature with huge black eyes which were fixated on me. I immediately ran to my tent and passed out from fright. The next morning as we were leaving, I saw in that cave a pale-looking face peering out at me. My friends didn't believe me, but one of my friends came up to me and told me that he saw it because he takes medication for his depression and he thought it was hallucinating.
Some background. I live in a rural county in Texas. I live in a rural suburb about 1.5 miles away from my grandparents, who live on an expansive Longhorn cattle ranch. My grandparents are currently on a trip to Michigan, and they needed someone to watch their house, take care of their diabetic dog, and water the garden for a while. I love being alone in the country, and I wouldn't be that far from my mom and stepdad, so I agreed to do it for them. The first 2 days were fine. It was on the third day that this began. It was about 8:30 at night. I had just made myself dinner, a Lunchable, and was ready to sit down in the living room and watch TV for a couple of hours until I went to bed. The recliner I was sat in at my grandparents' living room was directly beside their large glass doors, and I could see into their backyard and into their ranch from my seat. Just past the fence of the backyard were about a dozen deer, which wasn't odd considering there's an insane amount of deer where I live. I watched them for a second, when all of a sudden, I felt a wave of fear rush over me. It was like my brain stopped seeing the deer as something harmless, and instead, they became a very imposing sight. I scanned over the deer, and my eyes landed on one in particular. I noticed it, because even though it was a doe, it was a good bit taller than the others, and seemed to be oddly bulky and slightly misshapen. I watched it for about a second before, out of nowhere, its head shot up in the grass, and it stared directly at me. I hadn't been moving, and both my dogs were inside with me asleep. But I knew that it was focusing in on me. We stared for about a second, before it started to whip its head around in a really unnatural motion. The closest analogy I could make is when a video game glitches and the head of a character starts moving around wildly. It did this for another second before putting its head back down into the grass like nothing had happened. At this point, I knew something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. I called my mom, who was out fishing with my stepdad, and told her I was going home early because I was freaking out. I suffer from anxiety and can sometimes have panic attacks, so she understood, and I hauled ass to my car. All I grabbed was my phone, my Lunchables, and an Eeyore blanket that I had brought from my house. I don't really know why I grabbed the extra 2 things besides my phone, but I wasn't really thinking clearly. I'm usually a very careful driver, especially on my grandparents' shoddy gravel driveway, but I knew I had to get off their property or else I would be in real danger. My car is shitty, with the driver's side window permanently down. The entire time I drove up their half-mile-long driveway, I heard a sound coming just off from behind my car. It sounded like if a mammal tried to replicate the sound of a cicada. Very throaty and unnatural, and it was the same, constant distance from my car the entire drive off the property. Right in front of the gate before going back out onto the road were a few of my grandparents' cows. I laid eyes on a black figure amongst them, and almost like an optical illusion, it changed to be a full front profile on a longhorn. I wouldn't have thought this with my eyes playing tricks on me, because I was in a panic, if it wasn't for the horns. When I saw the quote-unquote cow, it was a black figure with no horns, but within a second I spotted it. It suddenly had 2 giant horns on either side of its head. I managed to drive home, but I still felt extremely unsafe. My instincts were telling me that if I went inside, I'd be cornering myself. At this point, I was sitting in my driveway, near hysterics, and on the phone with one of my friends, who I'll call Hope. Hope is extremely knowledgeable with this kind of stuff, and a true believer in the supernatural, and I knew she would be the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. She talked to me and calmed me down, and I explained the deer to her, and she got pretty freaked out and told me she knew what it probably was. I told her that I didn't want to know because I already had an idea as to what it might be, and her confirmation would only freak me out more. At this point, I made up my mind to go to my closest neighbor's house. I knew if I stayed alone, I would be putting myself in danger. So cue me crying and clutching an Eeyore blanket as I stroll up to my neighbor's backyard, weeping and apologizing profusely. Thankfully, my neighbors are saints, and they took me inside and calmed me down. They stayed up with me for a good hour until my mom and stepdad got home from the lake, and I felt safe enough to go home. Because I finally fully calmed down, I decided to go back to the ranch with my mom to clean up the mess I had left when I booked it out of there. But by the time we were there, even remotely close to the ranch, I felt the panic return. We got halfway down the driveway before I told my mom I couldn't do it and I had to go back. My mom was still planning to go back after she dropped me off at home, but I knew she'd be in danger if she went back alone. So I told her about the deer, and I told her I really don't want her to go back there that night, and she agreed. Hope has an older sister who's extremely well versed in the supernatural, and when she informed her of my experience, her advice was for me to never go back. This wasn't entirely realistic to me, since they are my grandparents and I did leave most of my stuff there. But I tried to take her warning as seriously as possible, and decided to greatly limit my time there and not to go back alone until my grandparents returned. The next day, which is today, at about noon, I had to go back to gather my stuff and check on my grandparents' diabetic dog, and let the bigger outside dog in, so he would be safe from the heat. The feeling of the place was still tense and strange, but not terrifying. Later, at about 8, I had to go back again, this time to feed the dog, let the other one out, and water the plants. I was way more hesitant about it, but my mom forced me to go. I was keeping my cool pretty well, until, as we were going down the driveway, I saw a deer standing in the road. I immediately felt the fear of the previous night, and started freaking out, telling my mom that I couldn't do it and that she had to turn around. As I was freaking out with my mom distracted, trying to calm me down, this fucking deer arched his back, like when a cat stretches. That tipped me over the edge in the full hysterics, but my mom still refused to take me home. My mom went inside my grandparents' house and I stayed in the truck. It called Hope again. I told her what I saw. She tried to calm me down, but nothing really worked. As I was freaking out on the phone, I saw a black shadow dart into and then out of the rearview mirror. That was it. I called my mom and was screaming for her to come back inside and take me home. Even during normal panic attacks, it never reaches this point, and my mom was screaming so harshly at my vocal cords hurt. She tried to convince me to come inside, and eventually, she decided to take me home, and I was hyperventilating and sobbing until the moment I arrived back. At this point, I'm terrified and I don't know what to do. I've never experienced anything like this before, and although I hope this is going to be an isolated sense of occurrences, I can't be for sure. For now, I'm going to try to stay away from my grandparents' ranch, but that really isn't realistic. I could use any advice you're willing to give.
I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Many times when you would ask natives about skinwalkers, they would get upset and would mostly refuse to even mention the word. My aunt went to a basketball game with the team my uncle was training. She stepped in since he was out sick. The game was on a reservation, and they were on a dirt road heading home around 8 at night, and she said an old woman started floating next to the van, and everyone started to scream. She told everyone in the car to pray, and she said that's when the old woman floated off into the dark. Nobody stopped praying until they got to the meeting line where she dropped off the kits. Another story was from my friend Raiden. He told me that they were at his grandma's house watching TV at night. We heard knocking on the door. He went to go answer it, and his grandparents yelled at him not to, saying that nobody comes out this late except for skinwalkers. He said after that, they heard knocking on the walls and windows, and the windows had boards that you could shut from the inside, so he never saw anything. He said the next day, he heard the walker get on top of their trailer outside and started stomping on it. Next day they came out, the roof was dented to hell. My friend Anthony told me a story of how him and his brothers were outside with their uncle, and they saw a skinwalker with blood-red eyes and pale white skin, but the face looked like a pig's. They said they sat there frozen, and they said that their uncle also froze in his spot after making direct eye contact with the walker, and the walker started walking towards them, and they said that they grabbed their uncle and dragged him inside and locked everything in and called the cops. Some pretty terrifying shit. I wouldn't go searching for any of these things.